They said he never blinked, not once, not when the candle blew out, not when they whispered his name from behind the door, and not even when they buried him the first time. They burned the church records. They said it was an accident, but buried inside an unindexed cabinet of state intake ledgers, there was one sheet, just one, yellowed, brittle and water-warped, but still legible enough to read 5 words that should not exist in any formal report. Returned. No longer biologically consistent. No illness, no injury, no act of violence, just a phrase that rewrites the rules of nature, quietly filed under a name that doesn't exist anymore. Whitmore. A surname that appears only once in the 1882 child assignment logs, then vanishes from the census, from the church, from property rolls, from photographs, like they were erased retroactively, one by one. But the boy stayed. He was never adopted, never legally born, never registered as deceased. But over a span of 41 years, that same face, that same 9-year-old face, showed up 5 separate times across different counties, assigned to different surnames, but always the same eyes. Pale grey, set deep, watching. The state called it clerical redundancy, a glitch in the system, but you don't get identical fingerprints across 4 counties by accident, you don't replicate retinal scars, and you don't reassign a child whose documentation was marked non-repeating biological artifact. That's not even legal language. You're not watching this by accident. Some part of you knows the world is built on omissions, on quiet removals, on facts folded under. They count on you not seeing the smudges at the edge of the page, the wrong signature in the corner, the ink that fades too fast. But this isn't a story, it's a reconstruction, a forbidden template pieced together from what they tried to bury, and what refused to stay buried. And if you're still here by the end, you won't be the same. You've been trained to believe that history is linear, a sequence of dates, events, and people, all moving forward. But what if some pieces aren't part of the line? What if they loop, echo, or worse, refuse to move at all? In the spring of 1882, Henrik and Maeve Whitmore, a devout couple of modest means, filed for guardianship of a state ward known only by a single letter, E. The official documents listed his age as 9, but nowhere did they list a birthday, not even an estimate. The ledger simply read, visual approximation consistent with 8 to 9 years, no signs of prior residence. That alone would have warranted a delay, but the Whitmores were approved in under 48 hours, bypassing the standard 10-day vetting period required for non-family placements. No home inspection, no interviews, just a rubber-stamped approval pushed through by a registrar whose name does not appear in any subsequent government employment file. When E arrived, the boy carried no belongings, wore clothes that didn't match the local tailor registry, and had one physical anomaly no physician could explain, a circular scar just below the base of the skull, perfectly symmetrical, like the imprint of a wax seal pressed too hard into flesh. Neighbors would later describe E as polite but hollow. He did not speak, but seemed to understand commands instantly, even abstract ones like, go where you belong, or do what's right. He never needed instruction twice, never asked for food, never cried, never slept. The Whitmores at first believed he was a miracle, a godsend for a couple who had lost their only child the year before in a fire that left no bones behind. But by the 4th week, Maeve stopped attending church. By the 6th, Henrik began boarding up the windows, not from the outside, but from within. And on the 52nd day, the couple submitted a handwritten note to the Bureau of State Wards that read, requesting return of subject E not due to danger, not due to complaint. We are not the right mirror. The form was unsigned, but the request was granted in full, no questions asked. They say the human brain can filter out things it isn't ready to see, like a camera set to blur when something too raw enters the frame, but the Whitmores didn't have the luxury of that blur, because E made sure they saw. He began doing small things at first, rearranging the furniture into perfect geometric patterns while they slept. Circles within squares, triangles pointing toward the door. And every morning, he'd be standing by the fireplace, hands behind his back, waiting for their reaction, watching them try to assign logic to something that refused logic. Henrik tried to discipline him once, not violently, just a firm grip on the boy's wrist. But the second he made contact, Henrik froze. Literally, not metaphorically. For 11 minutes, Henrik stood completely still, not blinking, not breathing. His eyes rolled back, his skin turned pale. Then he simply collapsed to the floor, convulsing like a man struck by lightning. The doctor from town blamed it on a shock-induced seizure. But there was no trauma, no head injury, and no medical history. When he woke up, Henrik whispered one thing to his wife. "He remembers things I haven't done yet." Maeve didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to, because that same week she began hearing music at night, faint, humming lullabies with no source. It wasn't coming from outside, and it wasn't coming from E either. It was coming from the attic. And when she climbed the ladder on the third night to confront the sound, she didn't scream, she didn't cry. She simply stepped down, closed the hatch behind her, and walked outside barefoot into the woods. She was found 3 days later, miles away, curled up in the hollow trunk of a dead oak tree, eyes open, fully awake, but silent. And in her lap, a burnt wooden music box, half melted from the house fire they never spoke of, the one that supposedly consumed their son. The box was closed, but still playing. People began to notice things about the Whitmore property. Animals avoided it, even the strays, the half-wild dogs and raccoons that once scavenged freely, gave the house a wide berth. And when the schoolmaster came to check on why Elias hadn't returned to class since the winter term began, he didn't even make it to the front door. Instead, he stopped at the gate. Not by choice. He stood still, as if anchored, pupils dilated, sweat dripping in the cold. When neighbors rushed over, he said only one thing. He spoke to me, inside my head. That was the moment the town of Black Hollow, Massachusetts started whispering. The Whitmore boy wasn't sick, he wasn't gifted, he wasn't disturbed. He was wrong, and things got worse when Elias stopped pretending to be normal. He began talking in languages he had never been exposed to. Languages Maeve later identified, with shaking hands and a dictionary, as Sanskrit, Latin, Babylonian cuneiform. But when asked what the words meant, Elias wouldn't answer. He would only smile. Then, in late February, Maeve found something buried beneath Elias's bed, a hole. Perfectly circular, roughly 18 inches wide, no bottom in sight. It wasn't dug, it wasn't made with tools. It was burned. Charred in a ring so precise it looked machine-made, though no machine in 1882 could have managed that. And worse, there were whispers coming from it. Not loud, not audible, more like suggestions, thoughts she hadn't thought until that moment. He's not yours. He was borrowed. And they want him back. That night she boarded the bedroom shut with wooden planks, crucifixes, and rock salt, an old Irish practice her grandmother taught her for keeping spirits still. But Elias wasn't a spirit. He was something else entirely. And he was now watching them from the inside of the house, not just with his eyes, but with something else. The whispers didn't stop after Maeve sealed the room. In fact, they grew louder. She began hearing them in her sleep, waking with her fingernails dug into the bedpost, her mouth open like she'd been mid-scream. When she opened her eyes, Elias would be standing in the hallway outside her bedroom door. Staring, not knocking, not crying, just staring. He hadn't spoken a word in 3 days, and yet, she heard his voice constantly, in her dreams, in the walls, once in the sound of boiling water when the kettle screamed and his voice screamed with it. That's when Maeve did something desperate. She brought in Father Callahan, a priest from 3 towns over known for handling spiritual disturbances. She didn't tell Edward, she didn't even warn Elias. But Elias knew. Before the priest stepped foot inside the Whitmore home, Elias met him at the porch and spoke his full birth name. Not just the common parts, the secret ones, the names his mother whispered during his baptism, the ones never written on any paper. The priest blanched. He turned to Maeve and said, "This boy, he's an echo, not the origin." When she asked what that meant, he only muttered, "There was something before him. There will be something after." He refused to enter. Instead, he gave Maeve a small wooden cross, whispered a prayer in Latin, and left. That night, Elias set the cross on fire, without touching it. It burned with a cold flame, blue and silent. And from that point on, Maeve stopped calling him Elias, because deep down, she knew that Elias had left weeks ago. Whatever stood in his place, slept in his bed, was just wearing his shape. Edward Whitmore was not a man of faith. He was a man of science, numbers, data, reason. So when he returned from a week-long business trip and found the house thick with melted wax, crucifixes on doorknobs, and his wife muttering prayers in corners, he was livid. "What is this madness?" he demanded. Maeve didn't answer. She simply pointed to Elias, who was seated perfectly still at the dinner table, staring at an empty plate. No food, no silverware, just watching. Edward approached, intent on asserting control. He slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "You will behave like a normal boy." Elias turned his head, not like a child, but like a marionette dragged by invisible strings. And in a voice not his own, he said, "I am older than the bones beneath your house, Edward." The air dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Candles flickered. The wood beneath Edward's hands felt wet. Then Elias blinked, just once, and the dining room lights shattered above them. Edward stared in stunned silence. Maeve wept softly. From that night on, Edward stopped questioning his wife's precautions. He avoided Elias, locked his study door, slept with a lantern lit, but the damage was done. Because science could not explain how a child with no formal education knew Latin, Hebrew, and, horrifyingly, a dialect of Old Enochian, a language believed lost to time, a language never written down, only heard. And the voice Elias used for it, it did not sound human. The local priest, Father Corbin, had always been skeptical of so-called possessions. He'd seen too many dramatics, too many grief-stricken mothers mistaking illness for evil. But Maeve begged him. She showed him the journal, Elias's journal, a book he had never been taught to write in. The symbols, the glyphs, the ancient markings no child should know. Father Corbin recognized them immediately, not from the Bible, but from the forbidden texts locked in the Vatican's underground archive. He turned pale. The next day, he arrived at the Whitmore home with holy water, relics, and trembling hands. But Elias didn't scream, didn't writhe, didn't curse. He smiled and whispered in a voice that chilled the marrow, "You've brought me the key, Corbin." The priest dropped his crucifix. His vision blurred. His ears rang like cathedral bells collapsing. Then Elias floated 2 inches off the floor, eyes rolling back, arms slack like a puppet on invisible threads. Maeve screamed. Edward tried to intervene, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as though the air had weight. Then, just as suddenly, Elias dropped to the ground. Normal again, breathing, innocent. Father Corbin fled the house that night. He never returned, not to the Whitmores, not to the church. He was later found in a distant village, half mad, repeating the same phrase over and over. The boy was not a vessel, the boy was the door. In the days that followed, the town of Greystone Hollow descended into whispers. People stopped making eye contact with the Whitmore family. Children were pulled from school. Doors that once opened freely now stayed bolted shut, even in broad daylight. Maeve and Edward kept Elias indoors. Not for safety, but because the boy was changing. His eyes would remain open during sleep. He began speaking in languages no one had taught him, Sumerian, Old Church Slavonic, even a dialect only recorded in one ruined monastery in Austria. He no longer responded to his name. Instead, he would pause, mid-meal, mid-sentence, mid-breath, as if listening. But there was nothing to hear, no sounds, no voices. Until one night, Maeve finally did. She had crept downstairs after a restless sleep. The candle in her hand flickered violently, though there was no wind, and in the sitting room, she heard it. A second voice, low, gravel-thick, ancient, coming from Elias, but layered under his breath. It was chanting, a rhythm, hypnotic, cyclical, like a lock being picked from the inside. She burst in. Elias turned toward her, not startled, but smiling, and with that low voice still whispering beneath his words, he said, "You shouldn't have heard that, Mother." Maeve dropped the candle. Flames spread across the rug as the boy stood, unharmed by the fire, eyes now black as ink, glimmering with something not of this world. She screamed, but no one came. No one would dare enter the Whitmore house after dark. And the worst part, the neighbors said they heard 2 screams that night. The next morning the house was silent. Neighbors stood across the street staring at the scorched curtains in the window. Not a soul had come or gone. Sheriff Amos Garland was the first and only to enter. What he found inside never made it into an official report. The furniture was untouched, save for the rug near the hearth, charred black and still warm to the touch. In the center of the room stood Elias, barefoot, still, unblinking. The boy didn't speak, not until Amos tried to step closer. Then he tilted his head and whispered, "It's in the floorboards now." Amos froze. "What is?" he asked, half hoping the boy wouldn't answer. Elias blinked once, slow, and pointed downward. There was nothing but wood beneath his feet. But then, a soft creaking, a dragging sound, as if something massive and wet was shifting just beneath the boards. Amos backed out of the room, bile rising in his throat. He would later describe the feeling as standing above a mouth that didn't know it was hungry yet. That night the sheriff boarded the Whitmore home shut, from the outside, nailed every window closed, locked the front and back doors, and posted a single sign, "Condemned pestilence." But those who knew the Whitmores, those who knew Elias, they didn't believe in rats, or rot, or mold. They believed in something older, something forgotten, something that had chosen a vessel, and now lived among them. In the body of a child, word spread quickly, not officially, not through newspapers or telegrams, but through whispers, firewood deliveries, and the backs of church pews. Don't go near the Whitmore house. Stay away from the boy with the dead eyes. Some said they saw Elias standing at the attic window at night, unmoving for hours, his face pale in the moonlight. Others swore they heard voices inside the boarded house. Not one voice, but 2, sometimes 3, all speaking in perfect unison, in a language no one recognized. A few brave or foolish boys from the next town dared each other to run up and touch the front door. One of them, Samuel Harnett, was never the same again. He came home shaking, bleeding from the nose, and unable to speak for days. When he finally did, the first thing he said was, "He's not a boy anymore." Elias was no longer seen in town. But the house changed. Grass refused to grow around it. Birds never landed on the roof. And dogs that passed it howled and whimpered, pulling their leashes taut to get away. It was as if the very soil beneath the house had been marked, spoiled. And yet no one dared tear it down. Not out of sentiment, but out of fear. Fear that doing so would release whatever Elias had become, or worse, whatever had been hiding inside him all along. It was in the spring of 1884 when Dr. Meredith Price arrived in Raven Hollow. A psychologist from Boston, trained in both the new sciences of the mind and ancient European occult traditions, a rare hybrid of reason and belief. He had been invited quietly by Margaret Whitmore. Her letter, never sent through public post, was hand-delivered by a man with no name, dressed in a black coat that smelled of cedarwood and ash. Dr. Price didn't ask questions. He simply came. When he arrived, he was not greeted with welcome. not from the townsfolk, nor even from the Whitmores themselves. Margaret met him at the edge of their property, pale and gaunt, her hair pinned with trembling hands. She spoke with a voice so strained it cracked between syllables. "He is upstairs, but I must warn you. It will feel like you're being watched the moment you step through the door. That's not your imagination." Price entered. The house groaned under its own age, but something else filled the space between the walls. A pressure, like walking underwater, thick and unnatural. He noted the cold, the flickering oil lamps, the wallpaper that peeled only in the shape of reaching hands. And then he heard it. From upstairs. Not footsteps, not breathing, but humming. A child's voice, Elias, humming a lullaby that hadn't been sung in New England for over 200 years. Dr. Price slowly climbed the staircase. Each step felt like sinking, not down into hell, but into memory. And when he reached the boy's room and turned the knob, the house fell completely silent, as if even it was holding its breath. The door creaked open. Dr. Meredith Price stood still in the threshold, his trained mind immediately passing the room for details, the subtle ones most would miss. The air inside Elias's room was wrong. It wasn't just cold. It wasn't just silent. It was still, in the way a forest goes still before a predator pounces, like sound and time had evacuated completely. Elias sat at the center of the room on a straight wooden chair. He didn't move. His hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes wide, but not blinking. The boy looked at the doctor, but there was something disjointed in the gaze. His pupils didn't dilate. His eyes didn't follow movement. It was as if he were looking through the man, like Meredith Price was a sheet of glass between him and something else. Then Elias whispered something, too soft to hear clearly. Price stepped closer. "What did you say, Elias?" The boy opened his mouth again, and this time the voice that came out was not his. It was deeper, cracked like tree bark. And it spoke in a language that hadn't been heard in Massachusetts since the Salem executions. A dialect so old and arcane, Dr. Price instinctively recoiled. He'd read fragments of it before, from burned manuscripts, the kind universities refused to house in their libraries. And then the boy smiled, not with joy, but with recognition. Like the thing behind his face remembered Dr. Price from somewhere else. "You were at Black Hollow," the voice said. "You turned your back when the others burned." The doctor froze. No one knew about Black Hollow, not even Margaret Whitmore. But Elias did, or the thing inside him did. Dr. Price reached for the charm inside his coat pocket, a pendant made of iron and juniper bark, and for the first time in decades, he whispered a prayer. Because he knew. He hadn't been called here to help Elias. He'd been called here because it wanted him next. Margaret Whitmore watched from the hallway, her breath caught in her chest as Dr. Price backed away from Elias's room. The door didn't slam shut behind him. It closed itself, quietly, deliberately, and a low hum, like wind through bone, echoed from behind it. Margaret rushed to the doctor's side. "What did he say? What's wrong with my son?" Dr. Price didn't answer at first. He looked older, not in years, but in soul. His hands shook slightly, his forehead damp with sweat. This was a man who had spent a lifetime treating what others called unexplainable, and even he looked afraid. "It's not possession," he said slowly. "It's something older." He took Margaret aside and asked a single question that no mother should ever hear. "Has Elias ever spoken of dreams that came true?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he dreams of people before they die, of places that haven't yet burned, of things we later read about in the paper." The doctor closed his eyes. He already knew. Elias wasn't sick. He wasn't possessed. He was a beacon, a vessel through which something ancient viewed the world. "I've seen this once before," Dr. Price whispered. "In Romania, a boy who spoke to things that hadn't yet happened. The monastery tried to hide him, burn the records, but it ended in fire and silence." Margaret stepped back, What does it want from him? Price didn't answer, because he wasn't sure it wanted anything from Elias. It might just be using him as a mirror, a window, or worse, a key. That night, the doctor didn't leave the Whitmore house. He sat in the hallway clutching his pendant, listening as Elias whispered in that cracked voice until morning. And just before dawn, every clock in the house stopped at 4:03 a.m. and never ticked again. The town of Marrow Creek awoke to silence. No birds, no distant train whistles, no rustling wind through the maples. It was as if the entire world had been briefly disconnected, and only one house knew why. Inside the Whitmore home, Dr. Price stared at the grandfather clock in the parlor, 03 a.m., still, unmoving, dead. Margaret found him there, still seated, still wide-eyed. He had written something in his notebook before falling asleep in the chair, or maybe before something put him to sleep. It was a single line. The boy speaks in circles, but they always end in fire. Upstairs, Elias hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with something like soot. Not tears, not dirt, but soot, as if his eyes had been gazing into a burning world that no one else could see. He didn't speak to his mother that morning. He only handed her a piece of crumpled paper. On it, drawn in jagged red chalk, was an outline of the Whitmore home, engulfed in flames. But stranger than that, in the drawing, a second Elias stood watching it all burn, expressionless, beside a man no one in the family recognized, and beneath the image, he had written, "It must happen, or it never ends." That day, Margaret hid the drawing in the attic. She didn't tell her husband. She didn't speak of it to Dr. Price. But she did write a letter, a desperate one, to her sister in Boston, begging her to come and take Elias away. Because something in her heart whispered that if Elias stayed, none of them would survive the month. That night, thunder rolled in over the hills. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The letter Margaret wrote never arrived. The courier who took it to the train station never returned. His horse was found wandering near the old iron bridge, saddle intact, no rider, no tracks leading away. It was as if the man had simply been erased. Margaret tried to send another letter the next morning, but when she opened her writing desk, the ink bottle had shattered, and the ink inside was bone white, like milk or ash. She threw it out, disturbed, and tried to forget. But Elias was changing again. He no longer answered to his name. He responded instead to a whisper he claimed to hear from the root cellar, something that called him by another name, Retinal, a name that didn't exist in any book anywhere. Dr. Price searched for it obsessively through journals, almanacs, and ancient texts he kept from his years abroad. But it was Elias himself who provided the closest clue. At dinner one evening, he quietly said, "Retinal means the one who remembers, even when we are burned." Everyone at the table froze. Margaret dropped her spoon. William, his father, rose from his chair and struck the table in frustration, shouting that this was madness, that Elias needed discipline, not indulgence. But Elias just turned to him with a gaze far older than any child's. "You don't remember the last house," Elias whispered, "but I do," and it ended in smoke. That night, William locked Elias in his room. He swore it was for the boy's own safety. He swore Elias would stay there until he learned to behave. But just before dawn, the lock turned from the inside. The door swung open slowly, and the Whitmores awoke to find Elias sitting quietly on the kitchen floor, drawing the same house again and again, each one more burned than the last, and in each, the same figure stood behind him, tall, faceless, dressed in black, watching, waiting. The drawings multiplied. Elias filled every page of every book in the house, cookbooks, ledgers, even the family Bible, each one defaced with a child's rendering of fire, houses melting into ash, and always that same dark figure standing nearby, as if orchestrating the destruction. Margaret tried to stop him. She took the charcoal from his hands. She hid the pencils. She even burned the paper herself. But Elias didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply walked to the parlor wall and began drawing with his finger, as if the soot on the wallpaper obeyed him. And there it was again, the burning house and the tall man. That same night, the dog refused to enter the home. It stood outside howling for hours, tail tucked, staring at the second-story window where Elias had once slept. Inside, a strange cold settled in. Not the kind from winter winds or drafty windows. This cold had weight. It pressed on their lungs, dimmed the firelight, and turned breath to mist even near the hearth. Dr. Price returned in the morning and found the family huddled in the sitting room. No one had slept. William looked 10 years older. Margaret wouldn't speak above a whisper. Their daughter Anna clutched her doll like a rosary, repeating one word over and over. Matches, matches, matches. But Elias sat upright on the couch. His eyes were glazed, unfocused. He didn't respond to his name or to touch. Only when Price spoke the name Retinal did Elias blink. Once, and slowly smile. He says it's time, Elias murmured. Time for what? Price asked. Elias turned his head toward the window. To remember. And then, without warning, the room shook. Not like thunder, not like a storm, but like something enormous and ancient had just taken a step, somewhere deep beneath the earth. And in that moment, every clock in the house stopped. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as if time itself was listening. The stillness lasted only a breath. Then, crash. A mirror shattered in the hallway, though no one was near it. A gust of wind roared through the house despite every door and window being locked tight. Anna screamed. Margaret grabbed her children, shielding them instinctively, while William leapt toward the fireplace poker. But Elias stood calmly. He walked straight through the chaos, through the wind, the falling picture frames, the rattling furniture, and placed his hand on the cold parlor wall. They buried it wrong, he whispered. What did they bury, Elias? Dr. Price asked. The memory. And with that, the wall cracked. A jagged line ran down from ceiling to floor, splitting the burning house drawing in two. But behind the plaster was something else, something hard, old, and carved. Price brushed aside the plaster. Etched into the foundation was a stone slab, slick with moisture. Symbols ran across it in a spiraling pattern. Not Latin, not Greek, not any alphabet the doctor had ever seen. At the center, a single word had been roughly scratched in newer script. Whitmore. Margaret's face turned white. That wasn't there when we built this house, she said. William nodded. We laid this foundation ourselves. There was no stone. We'd have seen it. But the slab pulsed faintly now, as if some heart beneath the earth had started beating once more. Slow, rhythmic, hungry. Elias sat cross-legged on the floor, his eyes fixed on the symbols. Then, without warning, he spoke in a deep foreign tongue. Not gibberish. This was too structured, too deliberate. It had grammar, form, authority. Price recorded every syllable phonetically in his notebook. Later, he'd send it to 4 different universities. None of them would return an answer. One linguist quit her post the next day. Another sent back a single word scrawled hastily in red ink. Stop. But on that night, in that room, as Elias spoke the words for the first time in human memory, something outside moved, and the sky began to darken, even though the sun had not yet set. The darkness that fell over the Whitmore estate wasn't like a storm cloud or the onset of evening. It was thick, unnatural, like a veil drawn over the sky. Birds fell silent, the wind stopped mid-breath, even the insects refused to sing. Inside, the room grew colder. Elias sat still, whispering in that strange, pulsing language, while the stone slab beneath the wall vibrated softly, as if it were resonating with something below the earth. Margaret clutched the crucifix around her neck. This is not of God, she said. Dr. Price stepped closer to Elias, watching the boy's lips carefully. The words came faster now, more confident, as though Elias was remembering a language he had never learned. Then, silence. Elias stopped speaking. He looked up at Price and smiled, not with mischief, not even childlike innocence, but with a knowing, ancient calm. "I've finished the call," he said. William, ever the skeptic, barked, "Call to who?" Elias turned slowly and pointed to the window. "You'll see him soon." As they looked outside, something appeared beyond the trees. A shape, towering, indistinct. It moved with the rhythm of the language Elias had just spoken. Each step it took matched the pulse of that ancient slab. Price's hands trembled. "This is impossible," he muttered. This is beyond science." But Elias didn't look away. "It was buried before your kind knew fire," he said. "It's not meant to be explained." Margaret screamed and pulled Elias toward her, but the boy resisted, not violently, just firmly. "He remembers me," Elias whispered. "He's answering." And then, the ground trembled. The stone slab cracked down the middle, and a low sound emerged. Not quite a voice, not quite a vibration, but something felt in the bones and behind the eyes. William fell to his knees, vomiting. Margaret wept openly. Price did the only thing he could think. He ran. Out the door, across the darkened field, notebook clutched tight. He ran until the unnatural dark gave way to pale sunlight again. Miles away. He would never return. But he would publish what he saw, and for that the world would soon learn the name Elias Whitmore. But never understand him, because some boys aren't meant to be explained. Some are meant to be remembered, or feared. 3 days after Dr. Price fled the Whitmore estate, his findings arrived at the New York Institute for the Paranormal Sciences, an envelope soaked by rain, scrawled in his trembling handwriting. Inside, 42 pages of notes, sketches, and a final letter. "They will call me mad," it read, "but if you've studied the old things, the pre-human glyphs, the harmonic codes beneath Sumerian stone, then you know what I saw was real. The boy is not possessed, he is not ill, he is a vessel, a voice, a return." The letter ended abruptly. Some claim Dr. Price took his own life, others say he simply vanished. Back in Finch County, the Whitmore property was sealed by local authorities after Margaret Whitmore was found wandering barefoot along the county line, muttering in tongues. Her eyes were gone, not injured, not bleeding, just missing. Smooth skin where they once were. She spoke only one phrase before being institutionalized. "He's still singing beneath the stone." The farmhouse was declared cursed by locals, abandoned to weeds and time, but travelers would still pass through occasionally. Some dared to camp on the grounds, others simply got lost. Each report eerily similar. "I heard a voice, like a child humming in the soil. The ground vibrated beneath me. It felt alive. I dreamed of a tall figure watching from behind the trees." By 1907, the Whitmore property had become something of a legend, the kind teenagers dared each other to visit. But few returned with jokes. Most never returned at all. Elias, for his part, was never seen again. No records, no sightings, not a single verifiable trace of the boy who had once spoken in lost tongues and cracked stone with syllables older than language. And yet, in 1912, an excavation team from Boston discovered a black stone slab 400 miles away beneath an abandoned chapel in Vermont. Identical markings, identical resonance. One of the men reported hearing a child's voice while they worked. "He's not gone," it said. "He's just listening." The excavation team didn't stay long in Vermont. After the black slab was hoisted out from beneath the chapel, strange occurrences began within hours. First, the recording equipment, meant to capture vibrations, started picking up faint whispers, though no one was speaking. Then, one of the workers, a man named Hollis Maynard, suffered a seizure. He screamed one word over and over between convulsions: "Elias, Elias, Elias." The project was abandoned within 3 days. The slab was placed in storage at Miskatonic University under lock and key, buried in a vault reserved for non-classifiable anomalies. and over time the name Elias Whitmore became just another footnote in occult journals and conspiracy forums. But the story didn't end there. In 1923, nearly 40 years after Elias disappeared, a traveling preacher arrived in a small Oklahoma town. He spoke 7 languages fluently, though he claimed he'd never been taught. His eyes were described as amber-colored, flecked with something reflective, like crushed stone. He called himself E.W., no full name. Locals were captivated. He predicted floods, fires, even the suicide of the mayor's son, all before they happened. When asked about his past, he would smile faintly and whisper, "I was born in a house with no echoes, but the earth still remembers." One night, after delivering a sermon about the voice beneath the veil, he vanished from his tent. Nothing was taken, no sign of a struggle. Just a stone in the center of his cot, smooth, warm to the touch, inscribed with the same symbols Dr. Price had drawn in 1882. Some say it was Elias, returned, changed, reborn. Others insist it was never a boy at all, but something that had used Elias as a door, and was still looking for new ones to open. Back in Ashford Hollow, the legend of Elias Whitmore never truly faded. His story was passed down in whispers, shared at sleepovers, told around bonfires, always ending with the same line: "He wasn't taken, he was chosen." But buried beneath the myth were fragments, scattered truths that had been carefully archived, boxed, hidden. One of those boxes ended up in the private collection of a man named Jonas Eberly, a retired folklorist obsessed with unsolved human anomalies. In 1964, Eberly published a rare monograph titled Children of the Interstice, citing Elias as the first verified case of trans-ontological migration. His claim, that Elias had not died or disappeared, but phased, slipped through some unseen crack in reality. What fascinated readers most was a photograph Eberly included in his work. Grainy, sepia-toned, supposedly taken in 1902 by a survey team in northern Finland. In the background, a boy, perhaps 14, standing barefoot on frozen ground, dressed in 19th century American clothing. The resemblance to Elias Whitmore was unmistakable. The boy was facing the camera, but his shadow pointed the wrong way. The sun was behind him, yet his shadow stretched toward the light. Skeptics called it a hoax, a double exposure, but the original glass plate negative was never found. Eberly died in 1971 under strange circumstances. His cabin burned down in the middle of a rainstorm. No other copies of Children of the Interstice were ever recovered. Only 3 people are known to own originals today. 2 of them refused to speak publicly. The third, he's since been institutionalized, claiming the book won't let him sleep. "He comes when it's quiet," the man once said, rocking in a padded chair. "He steps through where the cold touches the warm. That's where he waits." Some believe the boy in Finland wasn't Elias. But whatever Elias had become, years passed and the Whitmore home stood like a scar on the landscape of Ashford Hollow, its windows long shattered, roof bowed with rot, but no one dared touch it. The town voted multiple times to tear it down, each attempt met with unexplained delays. In 1983, a documentary crew working on a series about haunted American towns got permission to film inside the structure. What they captured was never broadcast, only whispered about among insiders of the production company. The lead cameraman quit halfway through filming, refusing to explain why. His last shot, a wide pan of Elias's childhood bedroom. On the raw footage, there's a moment, just a single frame, where a figure appears in the mirror above the dresser. The room was empty, no crew nearby. The figure isn't fully visible, only the upper torso of a child wearing a dark suit, face partially obscured by what looks like a veil of static. When slowed down, technicians noted that the reflection moved before the camera did. After that, the company shelved the project. All footage was boxed, labeled unusable, and stored at a temperature-controlled facility in Ohio. But 2 interns made copies. One of them, years later, leaked a still frame online. It surfaced briefly on an obscure message board dedicated to paranormal footage, before being wiped clean by a takedown request from a firm no one had ever heard of, Whitmore Gray Holdings, Ltd. There is no record of such a company existing. A reverse image search traced the firm's supposed headquarters to a demolished building in Connecticut, razed in 1984 after a fire with no reported origin. All attempts to trace the interns who leaked the footage ended similarly: dead ends, vanished accounts, and a warning posted anonymously on the same forum. Some mirrors don't reflect, they remember. People began wondering, what if Elias isn't a ghost, but an echo? Not a spirit trapped in this world, but a presence replayed endlessly by a house that refuses to forget. The local legend of Elias Whitmore evolved with each decade. Some said he was a psychic, others believed he was never human to begin with, born not of biology, but as a manifestation of collective grief, a kind of curse passed down through bloodlines or built from unspeakable acts. But those who truly studied the history of Ashford Hollow began to notice a disturbing pattern. Every 27 years, a child in the region, always a boy between the ages of 8 and 10, would go missing under eerily similar circumstances. No signs of struggle, no trace, no footprints. Just gone. In some cases, their bedrooms were found in complete disarray, mirrors shattered, curtains burned at the edges, clocks frozen at 3:33 a.m. One of the most chilling files came from 1909. A doctor named Malcolm Brayton treated a woman who had suffered a mental collapse after her 9-year-old vanished. In her fevered ramblings, she kept saying, "He didn't disappear. He stepped in. He went into the glass." Brayton documented the case in his journals, stored at a medical archive in New Haven. The final page of the entry includes a rough sketch of Elias's face, despite no known photograph ever being released. This discovery wasn't made until 2011, when an archivist digitizing old records flagged it for analysis. The sketch was analyzed by facial recognition software and compared to thousands of missing persons composites. The results returned a 99.8% match, with a boy reported missing in 1963. The two had never met. The families had no connection, but their eyes were identical. What could explain it? Theories poured in: time loops, reincarnation, dimensional bleed. Some even speculated that the house itself is alive, feeding on childhood energy, using Elias as a kind of anchor to stay tethered to this world. No theory stuck, because the truth was too slippery, too unnerving to face. Maybe Elias Whitmore wasn't waiting to be understood. Maybe he was waiting to return. By 2015, the Whitmore case had become an underground obsession on forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries, fringe science, and paranormal history. A user known only as Spectre Cell 17 claimed to have acquired a journal belonging to Elias's father, Matthew Whitmore, a document never released to the public. In it, Matthew described a moment 2 weeks before Elias disappeared. He stood in the hallway for nearly an hour, unmoving, eyes wide, as if listening to something no one else could hear. When I asked him what he was doing, he whispered, "It's showing me where the cracks are." That single line, "where the cracks are," became a rallying point for amateur sleuths. Many interpreted it to mean cracks in reality, thin places where the veil between dimensions weakens. Some tied it to an obscure theory called spatial resonance fracture, a concept proposed by a fringe physicist who believed certain emotional frequencies could alter time-space cohesion in localized areas. Still, no evidence ever confirmed that Elias had been the product of anything other than a tragic case of child mental illness, or worse, abandonment. But that's where the new evidence begins to darken everything. In late 2018, during the restoration of the Whitmore home for historic preservation, a team found a sealed chamber hidden behind the walls of Elias's bedroom. The space was no larger than a closet, but inside were 7 items, each carefully placed in a perfect circle: a cracked mirror, a child's worn shoe, a rusted compass, a bird's skull, a melted candle stub, a piece of fabric with a stitched E, and a journal page soaked in what appeared to be blood. The journal page contained one sentence, scrawled in Elias's distinct handwriting: "I didn't leave. I just learned how to stop being seen." No fingerprints, no signs of entry. The crawl space had been sealed from within, and the compass, it was still spinning, as if something inside that room was breaking every rule we've ever known. When the news of the hidden chamber reached the public, the story reignited with ferocity. Documentary filmmakers, paranormal investigators, and even particle physicists requested access to the site. But the Whitmore Historical Society, now the legal custodian of the house, sealed the property, citing security and unresolved ethical concerns. That only fueled speculation. An anonymous source later leaked thermal imaging scans taken from the upper floor, specifically Elias's room. The footage was chilling. Even with no heating, no wiring, no power source at all, the thermal image showed a human-sized heat signature pacing in a loop within the walls. Every 6 minutes. Always the same path. Always the same shape. Teams investigated exhaustively, even bringing in Department of Energy consultants who could find no rational explanation. The pacing figure never deviated, never responded to outside stimuli, never showed up on regular video. Some called it a temporal echo, a memory of motion burned into the fabric of the house. Others believed Elias had found a way to exist just beyond perception, not dead, not fully alive. A Stanford researcher proposed the most controversial idea of all. What if Elias Whitmore wasn't ahead of his time, but ahead of ours? His paper, later removed from Stanford's archives, claimed Elias might have tapped into a cognitive resonance pattern, an ability to shift between frequency planes of reality using thought as a carrier wave. The implications were staggering. If even partially true, it would mean the human mind, under extreme conditions, could alter its place in space, not physically teleporting, but recalibrating visibility within this dimension. And remember, Elias was obsessed with sound, waves, vibration, pattern. He may have simply found the right frequency, but the real shock came when that same Stanford researcher reported Eli went missing 2 days after publishing his findings. His final email to colleagues simply read, "He was never gone, just quiet enough to slip through." The Whitmore estate, now sealed behind metal gates and motion sensors, stands like a relic lost in time. Locals avoid it. Even wildlife seems to skirt the perimeter. But late at night, those who live near the property say you can hear it. A soft tapping, sometimes followed by what sounds like a child humming a tune no one can place. It's always the same rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. Like Morse code, or maybe a song Elias once played on his rusted violin. A group of amateur cryptologists tried to decode the pattern. They claimed it matched a 19th century encryption method used by naval signal officers, something Elias could have read about in one of his father's military archives. The decoded message was brief, yet haunting. "I never left. You just stopped listening." Skeptics brushed it off as coincidence. Others weren't so sure, especially when a second, longer pattern was recorded days later, one that took weeks to analyze. Its translation? "You're close, but don't look for me in time. Look in thought." A neuroscientist named Dr. Mira Antonelli took that to heart. She began running experimental EEGs on children who had reportedly seen Elias in dreams, and that's when she discovered something disturbing. Each child, regardless of age, background, or language, displayed the same brainwave anomaly, a synchronized hypertheta spike resembling a signature frequency, almost like a radio dial locked on one hidden station. Worse yet, when Dr. Antonelli tried to mimic that frequency using stimulation therapy, she blacked out for 6 minutes. When she awoke, she was sitting in a corner of her lab she didn't remember walking to, facing the wall, and humming that same tune. She never attempted it again, but her notebook included a final line, underlined twice. "He's not lost. He's just vibrating out of reach, and he's not alone." To this day, Dr. Antonelli sees interviews. She lives in a rural cabin under no name, completely off-grid. What did she hear during those 6 minutes? What did she see? She won't say. But she wears a necklace now, a silver pendant etched with a strange waveform. When asked what it means, she always gives the same answer. It's not a symbol, it's his name, written the way only minds can hear. Not long after Dr. Antonelli disappeared from public view, a new piece of evidence surfaced, one that shook even the most skeptical minds. It was discovered in the archives of a decommissioned asylum in upstate New York, stored in a misfiled box labeled Whitmore E. The box had been untouched since 1902. Inside was a single reel of phonograph recording tape, nearly fossilized with age. It had no label, only a handwritten note in pencil that read, "Property of E. Whitmore, do not play without intention." After painstaking restoration, audio technicians were able to extract a fragment of the recording. What they heard was unlike any known phonograph record of the era. It began with a low mechanical hum, followed by what sounded like pages turning underwater. Then, a voice. Not a child's voice, not Elias's, but hundreds of them, speaking in unison, like a chorus in reverse, layered atop one another. The words were unintelligible, until someone realized they had to be played backward. When reversed, the message became clear. "We are still awake." That one sentence was enough to cause 2 technicians to walk off the project entirely, refusing to ever return. But it didn't stop the final analyst, a linguist and acoustic specialist named Dr. Malcolm Shard. He isolated a second, fainter voice beneath the chorus. It was Elias. Only one sentence came through. "I opened it, Father. I can't close it." No one knows what it was. A portal, a dimension of thought, a frequency that reality couldn't contain. The implications terrified even the boldest minds. The reel was quietly sealed back up and reportedly handed over to an unnamed government department. When asked about it in a rare interview, Dr. Shard simply replied, "That boy found something, or maybe it found him. Either way, we weren't supposed to hear that tape, and neither were you." Since then, a growing online community has dubbed Elias the frequency child. Some believe his mind continues to exist in a bandwidth accessible only during deep unconscious states, lucid dreams, near-death experiences, or moments of mental collapse. A Reddit thread with over 100,000 comments asks the same haunting question. If he's still broadcasting, who's listening? The better question may be, what happens when we answer? After the release of the phonograph transcript, a rash of disturbing incidents began cropping up in isolated corners of the world, patterns that mirrored Elias's story almost too precisely. In a rural village in Romania, a 7-year-old boy was found scribbling complex equations in the dirt, equations later identified as advanced string theory. He had never been to school. His mother claimed he spoke in pulses at night, like static turned into language. In a remote part of Saskatchewan, a teenage girl vanished for 3 days. When she returned, she claimed she had been inside a hallway of humming light, and that a boy named Elias told her how to get back. She drew a picture of him for authorities. The likeness was uncanny. And in a mental institution in Maine, a patient who had not spoken for over a decade suddenly awoke screaming one word repeatedly, "Frequency, frequency, frequency." The Whitmore case, once considered closed, became a lightning rod for paranormal theorists, experimental physicists, and even covert intelligence circles. Leaked documents from within the Pentagon suggested a program known only as Project Dovetail may have been launched in response to the Whitmore case in the mid-20th century. Its rumored goal: to locate individuals who, like Elias, resonated on unnatural wavelengths believed to unlock doors not meant for human minds. All this leads us to a chilling possibility. What if Elias wasn't unique? What if he was merely the first? The blueprint. Some argue the human brain is like a radio. Most of us tune into reality on the same station. But Elias, he picked up signals from somewhere else, or worse, someone else was using him to transmit their own. And what if that channel, once opened, can't be closed? Across various forums, a pattern emerges. People experiencing similar phenomena report a shared dream. A boy with black eyes standing in a room filled with clocks, none of which tick. He whispers the same phrase, "You're not awake yet, but you will be." In 1979, Nearly a century after Elias Whitmore's disappearance, a sealed wooden crate arrived anonymously at the University of Chicago's Department of Anthropology. No return address, no paperwork, just a single word scorched into the wood: return. Inside the crate was a collection of personal items, a cracked mirror, an antique compass that spun erratically even without movement, and at the bottom, a worn leather journal, signed E. Whitmore. It was unmistakably his handwriting. The ink had faded, but the words were clear, penned in a looping, nervous scrawl that mirrored the samples from 1871. There were detailed sketches of strange machines, diagrams of rotating geometric shapes, and pages filled with unfamiliar symbols, none of which matched any known written language. But the most haunting entry came near the end. "It is not a place you go, it is a state that finds you. The further I listen, the louder they become. They speak not in words, but in architecture, in spirals and echoes. I fear I am becoming their echo." Linguists attempted to decode the symbols. Physicists tried to replicate the compass's erratic behavior. Even CIA analysts, according to declassified FOIA documents, took interest, linking the symbols to anomalous signal intercepts picked up by the NSA during Cold War operations in the Arctic Circle. Every thread seemed to circle back to one conclusion: Elias had not died. He had gone somewhere, or was taken, and left behind breadcrumbs for someone who might understand. That someone, it seems, may be us. Because here's what keeps researchers up at night. The final page of the journal contained a crude map, a map that didn't correspond to any known country, continent, or celestial body. But when viewed under infrared light, coordinates appeared. Those coordinates led to a location in the Nevada desert, and when a private expedition team TED that site in 2004, their instruments reportedly malfunctioned instantly. Compass needles spun, radios picked up whispers in languages no one could identify, and one team member, upon returning, fell into a coma, muttering a single phrase: "I saw the boy. He's still waiting." In 2012, a group of independent researchers, led by a theoretical physicist named Dr. Miriam Halstead, launched a private initiative called the ECHO Project. The goal was to investigate architectural anomalies and non-linear time phenomena connected to cases like Elias Whitmore's. They didn't publicize their findings, but 5 years later, in 2017, a former project member leaked classified documents to an encrypted forum on the dark web. They included photographs, grainy infrared images of what appeared to be a lone child standing in the center of a massive, spiraling ruin buried deep beneath the Nevada desert. He wore clothes from the 1800s, and most disturbingly, the timestamp on the photo was 2029. The forum exploded with speculation. Was it a hoax? Time manipulation, residual haunting? But those who analyzed the metadata confirmed that the image had not been altered. The boy in the photo had Elias Whitmore's exact facial structure, verified using AI facial mapping software and old Whitmore family photographs. There was also a short, 13-second audio file attached. You can hear faint breathing, a whisper of static, and then a distorted voice that seems to say, "He remembers the way back, but he's not allowed to return." Government agencies were silent. Dr. Halstead vanished. And the forum? Wiped. Every post, every user profile scrubbed from existence within 48 hours. Some claimed it was a hack. Others whispered it was a cover-up. But one thing was certain: Elias was never meant to be found. If the journal, the compass, and the coordinates were a breadcrumb trail, then maybe Elias didn't leave them behind to be rescued. Maybe he left them to warn us. And now, we're listening. It wasn't just fringe theorists or anonymous internet sleuths who took interest. In late 2021, the Smithsonian Institute quietly added a new exhibit to their archives of the unexplained. It was discreetly placed, no fanfare, no press release, titled simply, "The Whitmore Anomaly." Inside a dimly lit glass case sat 3 items: a tattered leather-bound journal, open to a page scrawled with unfamiliar glyphs that didn't match any known language. A child's compass, frozen mid-spin, the needle locked in a direction no modern map could match, and a photograph, long rumored to be a fake, but now authenticated, of Elias Whitmore, standing in front of a doorway to nowhere. The doorway appeared carved into bare stone, surrounded by symbols etched so precisely they seemed burned into the surface. But what stole visitors' breath was the look in Elias's eyes. Not confusion, not fear, but understanding. It's as though he knew where he was going, and perhaps, more chillingly, he knew we would come looking. Speculations began to evolve. Some claimed Elias was never lost, that he was taken, chosen by something ancient, something beyond the limits of human perception. Others suggested Elias was never entirely human to begin with, a genetic anomaly, a vessel, a messenger. In the months following the exhibit's reveal, 7 researchers involved in the initial analysis of the journal resigned abruptly. 2 reported intense, vivid dreams featuring a voice calling them by name, a child's voice. 1 even claimed to have seen Elias standing at the foot of his bed whispering, "Don't follow the compass, follow the echoes." The message repeated over and over until the man was institutionalized. Was it guilt, a psychotic break, or had Elias found a way to reach back? We've always believed history is linear, that time moves forward, never backward. But what if Elias, this unexplainer, blue boy, was proof we were wrong? That somewhere beyond what science can grasp, time loops back on itself and waits. In 2023, a retired NASA physicist named Dr. Lydia Corwin, a woman once praised for her work on deep space signal anomalies, came forward with a bizarre confession. She claimed that during a black-budget project in the late 90s, she and a team of researchers intercepted a non-random signal from the vicinity of the Epsilon Eridani star system, a faint, pulsing rhythm buried beneath cosmic background noise. When they decoded the modulation patterns, the result wasn't coordinates, it wasn't a language, it was a name. Elias Whitmore. At first they dismissed it as coincidence, but then came the matching birth date, the year, the precise location, Thornhill County, 1882. That's when the project was shut down. No reports, no press coverage, no further investigation. Dr. Corwin's data was destroyed, or so she believed, but after retiring she kept a single backup disk hidden in her personal effects, and when she finally viewed it again in solitude, she found something new had been embedded, something that hadn't been there before. A short audio file, scratchy, warped, but unmistakably the voice of a child speaking through static. "I am not lost. I was always meant to leave. You're just hearing me now." And then, silence. Corwin never released the file publicly. She feared ridicule, or worse, reprisal. But she did submit a sworn affidavit to a private research archive. In it, she wrote, "Whatever Elias is, or was, he's trying to communicate, not with the past, but with the present, with us." This raised terrifying possibilities. Had Elias been taken, transcended, or had he evolved beyond linear time and space, a traveler moving through dimensions the human mind can't yet fathom? As more independent researchers begin reviewing the incident, there's one growing consensus among those brave enough to whisper it aloud. Elias Whitmore wasn't an anomaly. He was a harbinger. If there's one thing the story of Elias Whitmore teaches us, it's that not all mysteries beg to be solved. Some whisper warnings through generations. Others stretch across the stars, waiting for the moment we dare listen. And sometimes the most inexplicable phenomena don't come from the outside, but from within. After all the exhumations, the blood samples, the strange frequencies, the confessions of old men and dying scientists, we are still left with one unbearable question. What was Elias Whitmore? A gifted child? A cosmic accident? A divine messenger? Or perhaps something worse, a mirror showing us the terrifying limits of our understanding? No grave holds his remains, no photograph captures his face clearly. and every surviving written record of Thornhill's local history before 1885 has either vanished or spontaneously corrupted in digitization efforts. Yet his presence lingers, like a pulse beneath the earth, like a memory implanted in minds that should never have known him, and those who still live in the ruins of Thornhill speak of a boy they sometimes glimpse in the fog, silent, watching, waiting. Elias was never a mystery to be solved. He was the seed of one yet to bloom. So when you feel that sudden cold in your bones, or hear a child's voice whispering your name in an empty room, don't look back. He's not gone. He never was. He's just ahead of us, waiting for the rest of us to catch up. If there's one thing the story of Elias Whitmore teaches us, it's that not all mysteries beg to be solved. Some whisper warnings through generations. Others stretch across the stars, waiting for the moment we dare listen. And sometimes the most inexplicable phenomena don't come from the outside, but from within. After all the exhumations, the blood samples, the strange frequencies, the confessions of old men and dying scientists, we are still left with one unbearable question. What was Elias Whitmore? A gifted child? A cosmic accident? A divine messenger? Or perhaps something worse, a mirror showing us the terrifying limits of our understanding? No grave holds his remains, no photograph captures his face clearly, and every surviving written record of Thornhill's local history before 1885 has either vanished or spontaneously corrupted in digitization efforts. Yet his presence lingers, like a pulse beneath the earth, like a memory implanted in minds that should never have known him, and those who still live in the ruins of Thornhill speak of a boy they sometimes glimpse in the fog, silent, watching, waiting. Elias was never a mystery to be solved. He was the seed of one yet to bloom. So when you feel that sudden cold in your bones, or hear a child's voice whispering your name in an empty room, don't look back. He's not gone. He never was. He's just ahead of us, waiting for the rest of us to catch up.